Greetings, everyone. My name is Warren Smedley. I am speaking to you from Birmingham, Alabama. Today's topic is making high-impact presentations. We're going to go over some tips and tricks. Your professor, Mara Blooms, asked me to share some thoughts. I am a career healthcare administrator, much like you are, and have learned how to make presentations. We'll talk about that. The fear of public speaking is called glossophobia. There's actually a name for it. It's the number one fear that most people have. 77% of the population has some level of anxiety regarding public speaking. Some of that may come from inherently we have this fear of being stared at. A direct gaze can signal dominance or threat, and we have become hypersensitive as human beings to being gazed at. We're afraid that if people are gazing at us, that something bad might happen. Out of that 77%, 7% of Americans fear public speaking to a clinically debilitating level. And females slightly higher than males, but both having a significant issue with that in that 7%. Studies show that for those who were impaired by public speaking, by the fear of public speaking, it can affect their wages negatively. These are negative impacts, negative 10% impact on wages, negative 10% impact on graduation, negative 15% on promotion to management. What makes us anxious? Well, 90% of the anxiety we feel before making a presentation comes from a lack of preparation, from poor preparation, and we can fix that. As we think about making presentations, and we'll go over some tips together today, presentations, how you communicate, has a lot of different aspects to it. Only 7% of your communication is based on the words that you choose, the actual content. The other 93% is based on how you say it. So 55% are your nonverbal communication and 38% your vocal tone and pacing. If we can dedicate 70%, in this case recommended by a blog, 70% of your time to preparing, you're going to do well. My very first presentation, I fainted when I was 23. You can learn to be better at this. So today's learning objectives: review presentation tips and tricks, become more skilled in high-impact communication, learn a technique for handling questions and answers. This, I find, is one of the areas that people fear the most, handling questions and answers. It's one thing to share the information that you've prepared. It's another to be asked questions, and it's hard to prepare. You don't know what people are going to say, and it creates a lot of anxiety. There are ways we can handle that. We're also going to learn a technique, really formula for how to share our opinion with power. Let me introduce myself again. My name is Warren Smedley. I'm a late career hospital administrator. I have been working at UAB down in Birmingham, Alabama, served as a administrator over the cancer program down here for 10 years. I'm currently a consultant with a healthcare consulting company. I have a master's degree in healthcare administration, master's degree in health safety, and am completing now my doctorate in healthcare leadership, working on my dissertation now. I also spent 11 years working with the Dale Carnegie organization, teaching people how to make presentations as well as leadership skills. Some ground rules that I like to have when I'm I teach a class here at UAB, healthcare marketing, to the master's in health administration students. Some of the ground rules that I set, which I find them to be helpful when you're setting rules for your workplace. The first is to encourage people to ask questions. We have the 40% rule. When you're communicating with someone at any given point in time, 40% of your audience will be having a stray thought run through their mind, and they'll be distracted and they'll miss something. So make sure that the environment is comfortable for asking questions so that people can get clarity on what you're actually talking about. Encourage active participation. And in my classroom, I encourage G-rated participation. respect others, keep the environment positive. When people are learning, when people are listening, when people are trying to understand your position on something, when you're presenting, you want to create a positive environment so that they're eager to learn. You don't want to create a negative environment which may block their hearing, their learning. We want to listen to learn. We want two-way communication, and we want to keep our minds open. We want to avoid war stories when you're doing presentations, and there are ways to do that in the questions and answers. We'll talk about that. People love to pick out those extreme situations and say, yeah, but what about this? And then they hit you up with their war story. And we want to redirect those when we're making presentations. You want to start and end on time. Don't run your presentations over, because that wears people out. First thing we want to do is talk about the purpose for our presentation. Presentations are different than meetings. You have to prepare a presentation, and they have many different purposes, and you have to think about the purpose, what you're trying to communicate, what you're trying to accomplish, and then design your presentation around the purpose. So what's your purpose? Is it to educate or gain understanding? If you're educating or trying to get people to understand your point of view, that's different than if you're trying to get someone to do something, trying to get them to take an action, asking for or gaining cooperation from someone. If you want to motivate them to do something specific or inspire or persuade, like if you're trying to raise money for your hospital or your organization, that's an inspirational, persuasive talk, and that would be different, put together differently. Something I like to tell people who are preparing their presentations is that in today's world, our audiences want to be entertained. That doesn't mean you have to do stand-up comedy, but they want to be entertained, and I call this edutainment. We want to educate in a light and open, interesting way. So we want to be lively and interesting. We want to keep people's attention. You also need to know your audience. It's very important to understand who you're presenting to. You have your purpose. Now you got to figure out, who am I presenting to? And then you structure how you share your information to the people that you are speaking to specifically. So the types of presentations we'll be talking about really today are within the context of work. And typically you're presenting something, an idea to or report, either to your team or to your leadership. So when you think about your audience, you got to think about presenting your information in a way that makes sense to them, the way that they want to absorb it, understand it, work with it. Some of you may be familiar with the DISC behavior style assessment, the DISC profile. I find this to be particularly helpful. If you know much about it, you should, or if you don't, you should learn a little bit about it. But this helps you to prepare, because different people receive information differently. Let's start with the directors. Frequently, not always, but frequently, a CEO falls into a category of a director. They like information given to them quickly. They like to come up with their decisions quickly. They don't like to be weighed down and burdened with the facts. They don't like to spend a whole lot of time doing chit chat about family and that kind of thing. They want to get right to the point. They want just the facts to make the decision and move on to the next thing. Frequently, you'll find that your financial team, if you're presenting something to the financial team, they are more in this conscientious analyst category, and they are much more interested in the detail. They're going to want the detail. So if you're presenting to the finance team, prepare your presentation with extra detail, extra numbers, extra care around the numbers, making sure that your numbers are correct. Spend time there. Give them time to absorb. In fact, it's really good if you can give them a preview ahead of time so they can actually look at the numbers or the data to be prepared for the presentation. Do that, but make sure you've got lots of information. Your influencers, frequently they may be human resources or marketing people. They actually like to think out loud. So they're going to want time to ask questions, to think out loud. They're going to typically will process verbally. and they'll help think things through verbally. So give them an opportunity to think things through. They're not super on detail, but they like to talk out loud, think out loud. Stabilizers, a lot of times your pediatricians, your primary care, family physicians are going to be people who are very concerned about fairness and very concerned about making sure that everybody has a chance to participate, and they're going to want to think, they're going to be quiet. They're probably not going to ask a whole lot of questions, so you may have to be prepared to help them ask important questions because they have them. They just may not be willing to ask them. As you prepare for your presentation, here are a few tips. Be prepared personally. Now, you have every right to be confident because this is your material. So people are naturally nervous. Nervous is normal, but you have every right to be confident. This is your material. You own it. You've prepared it. If you've prepared it yourself and you've thought about it, you've been thoughtful, you've earned the right to share it. So be confident in that. No one cares how much you know until they know how much you care. So just getting up there and vomiting your information on people is not helpful. Make sure that people know that you're sincere, that you're interested in everybody's well-being. Practice, yes. Memorize, no. You keep notes handy, but I've seen lots of people memorize their presentations. They get nervous. They get up in front of the group. They get up in front of the board of trustees, and they freeze and they forget. They don't have notes. They've memorized and they can't remember where they are, and they lose their place. It usually doesn't flow well if you've memorized. Practice it, yes. Know where you're going, yes. Keep your notes handy, yes. Try not to memorize. Be yourself. Don't try to put on some show that's not you. Be you. Be yourself. And do a quick hair and teeth check. I judge a case competition for the Masters in Health Administration program every year. And it's amazing how distracting these professional teams, these students will get up and they'll be all nervous and ready to go. And they won't have checked that their hair is straight or that their tie is straight. And they'll get up there, and it's amazing how distracting that is when someone hasn't taken the time. So get someone to, make sure that you're together. When you make your presentation, never, please never apologize for being unprepared or being nervous. You may be nervous. You may be unprepared. This may be a very impromptu presentation, but never tell people that for this reason. They don't know. They don't know that you're unprepared. They don't know that you're nervous. And until you tell them, they might try to guess it, but they don't know. And you don't need to apologize for that. Jokes rarely work, and unless you're gifted, I would skip them. If you're gifted at telling jokes, that's fine, but for most of us, jokes fall flat. I will occasionally throw things in. You may be able to find a picture or a cartoon, as long as it's not too complicated, that you could throw in to lighten things up, because again, people like to be entertained as they go, but don't try telling a joke. Always begin with an attention-getting opener. Use something to get started and get people in. You got 15 seconds to catch people's attention, especially if you're making a presentation to the board of trustees or to the executive committee, and they've got 3 hours of presentations and your 15-minute presentation falls right in the middle of it. They're bored. They're not paying attention. You got 15 seconds to catch their attention. Kind of like we did in starting this lecture with the 77% of people being afraid of speaking. Start with an attention-getting opener. It could be a startling statement or a critical fact, something you read in the newspaper or heard on the radio. Could be a compelling question. Ask a question that supports what you're about to say. Tell a story. People love to hear stories, and stories are great when you can incorporate them into your presentation. Tell little anecdotes. Tell about a patient. Tell about an organization that provided support, or a way that your organization supported someone. Avoid the claw. Now, this is something that people do all the time. This is body language. Remember in the beginning, we talked about body language being 55% of communication. This is a TED Talk, and you can see the presenter is holding his hand in a claw-like fashion. And they're showing him on the screen there behind him. That claw looks aggressive. It looks angry. And people tend to point towards their audience and open their hand like the claw towards the audience. That is aggressive and turns people off. It's bad, negative body language. It's better to definitely use your hands, but it's better to do what this lady's doing, and that's have an open hand, palm facing up, and it's warm, it's open, it's inviting rather than aggressive. So avoid the claw. When you're putting your PowerPoint together, generally speaking, there's the 6x6 rule. Try, if you can, it's not possible all the time, but try if you can to have no more than 6 lines on your slide and no more than 6 words per line. It's not always possible. I violate it here today, but when you can, it helps you to be more succinct. It helps your audience to follow what you're talking about. They don't get lost. It's not difficult to read. And your PowerPoint should not be the presentation. You should be making the presentation. Your PowerPoint should just support your presentation. And the biggest fear people have is that they're going to make some kind of a mistake. I learned early on that if you lay an egg, step back, admire it, admit it, and then just move on and forget about it. Make a mistake, sorry, made a mistake, and then move on. Try to forget about it. People are very forgiving because they know that they're going to make mistakes when it's their turn. People are very forgiving if you just move on. Don't worry about it. It's not that big of a deal. Somebody important, Dr. Malcolm Knowles, wrote a book. He wrote many books, but in 1984 wrote a book about adult learning theory. A few things to keep in mind when you're thinking about how adults receive information. Adults want some control over their learning experience. They learn more effectively through guided discussion. So if you can involve them in the process in your presentation, that's good. They learn best when they have a need to learn. So if you can make it compelling. And adults have different learning styles. Some learn by seeing, some learn by hearing, some learn by doing. And all 3 of those, if you can incorporate them in your presentation, some visual, some auditory, some activities where they're actually thinking or moving is helpful. Some of his basic principles, Dr. Knowles' basic principles: adults need to understand the purpose and objectives of the presentation. Your environment, to the extent that you can control it, should be friendly, relaxed, and involve all of the senses. Adults should be encouraged to participate and accept responsibility for being engaged. So get them involved. Presenters, this is us, should relate to and make use of audience experience. So if you know people in your audience, point out things that they've done and engage them that way by reflecting on the things that experience around the table has brought to the organization. Let's take a moment and talk about handling questions and answers, because this creates a lot of anxiety for people. What if I get grilled? I can give my information, but what if I get grilled at the end and I don't know how to handle it? I thought this picture was fun. Can you imagine going to an actuary conference? That would be really fun, wouldn't it? So when you ask a question, or when a question is asked, give people time to think. This is hard, but if you ask the audience a question, you have to be willing to step back and let them think and then come up with the question. Never drill down on someone. So if you're going to respond, try to respond to the entire audience rather than really drilling down into one individual. It makes them, back to that gazing at people. We get uncomfortable if we get gazed upon. So if you're answering a question or having a dialogue, try to speak to the entire audience. Don't grade questions. You'll hear this all the time. Somebody will say, "Oh, that's a great question." And then you get trapped, because if the next person asks a question and you don't say it's a great question, it makes them feel like their question wasn't worthy. Everybody has good questions. There's really no such thing as a bad question, because everybody wants to understand or needs to understand. So if we don't grade individual questions, we don't get ourselves into trouble. It's okay to say, I don't know. If you don't know the answer, don't be thrown off by that. Telling people that you're willing to find out and get back to them is good. That's not a problem. So how do we start with handling questions and answers? Everybody has questions. The point here is get people to share them. So you start with asking your audience, who has the first question? So we would start, when you finish your presentation, you would start and open up the questions and answers time by saying, we have time for questions and answers. And if you have 5 minutes, you say, we have 5 minutes for questions and answers. And make sure you say questions and answers, because answers is what people are looking for. And we always begin with who has the first question. You make the assumption that somebody has a question. Who has the first question? And typically what I'll do is I'll actually raise my hand to show them how to signal that they have a question. So I'll raise my hand and say, okay, who has the first question? As the questions and answers time rolls on, who has the next question? And so on until you're out of time. Then listen carefully to what people say. If you're not sure how to respond quickly, it's fine to repeat it or paraphrase the question. That gives you a little bit of time to think about it. It helps you to clarify and understand the actual question. If it's necessary, you can actually paraphrase it in a way that's easier for you to answer. So to sort of re-paraphrase it, pairing the question, if it's a big, huge, bold question that's very broad and could answer a lot of different ways, you could kind of narrow it down by paraphrasing, well, what I hear you saying is, and then zero in on the part that you are comfortable answering. And then, of course, respond. How do you end the questions and answers? So you get down to your final moments. You say, okay, we have time for one more question. Who has the final question? And again, raise your hand to show them how. If there are no questions, something that you might consider is being prepared with a question or two of your own, things that you would like to talk about, or things that you anticipate people would have as a question. Maybe they haven't thought of it, but they will have it later. And you can actually say, well, something that I thought of that I was prepared to answer, somebody might ask this question, and then you state the question and answer it yourself. That's really helpful if you have some point that you've either prepared to answer or you think would be important to share at that point. You can actually insert your own question in there. And then you want to restate the important point of whatever your presentation was. So your presentation, you're asking for funding for something, or you're asking for staffing for something. And now you've had questions and answers, and people have kind of been distracted from whatever you asked for. So restate your closing points and then finish with that. One more tool technique that I'd like to share with you, and we'll actually have a chance to kind of talk through this together in a practice setting in the class time together, is how do we handle a difference of opinion? So rarely do we actually have 100% agreement on everything. That's unusual. People's opinions are slightly different about how you should do things. What's the best way to do this? What's the best practice? Should we invest this money this way, or should we invest it in this over here? Do we need more staff? Do we need to change the process? Should we be doing this differently? Should we offer a new service? And people have slightly different opinions. Sometimes they're big differences of opinion. Other times they're slight. So I found that this particular format for handling differences of opinion are particularly helpful. When you have a difference of opinion with someone, it's helpful to start with a cushion, and cushions soften the mood of the discussion, because in a difference of opinion, it might be collegial or it could be a little bit testy, and you want to try and soften it. So things like, I could see how you might think that, or I can see what I understand what you're saying. I see what you're saying. How about if we consider this, or let's consider this? I can appreciate your perspective. I can appreciate what you're saying. Have you considered this aspect of this particular situation? And what do you think would happen if this? Now, of course, you choose the type of cushion that is appropriate for the setting and for the conversation. But the idea here is to acknowledge the other person, acknowledge that they have their opinion, and then gently transition over to sharing your opinion on this. And it may be that you're making the presentation and someone else stands up with a different opinion and you now have to reply back. Or maybe somebody else is making the presentation and they've asked for feedback, and now you have to give a difference of opinion. Compare this idea with that idea. Okay, there's some words that we want to avoid when we have a difference of opinion. Try to avoid these words. Please don't tell people directly to their face that they're wrong. They may be wrong, but if you say, no, you're wrong, that's stupid, then it creates incredible defensiveness, and then you've got a serious blockage to try and overcome. You're going to shut down the conversation and not be able to collegially have that discussion. If you start with yes, but it really, or well, yeah, however, then what it tends to do is cancel out the things. You can say really nice things in your cushion. Oh, I understand where you're coming from, but it basically says, yeah, but you're wrong. So it cancels everything out. So try and avoid the but word. Should, if it's used incorrectly as a transition word, could place blame on others. So-and-so should have done this. Yeah, but if so-and-so should have done that, or could have done that, would have done that. And pointing individuals out. You made me do this. You did this situation. We don't want to place blame on others. The whole point of having these kinds of discussions is to come to a good, solid solution. And if you shut down the conversation, you will not find a good, solid solution. Words that get used frequently, always, never, extreme words like that are difficult because they're rarely true. And all somebody's got to do to poke a hole in that argument is say, well, here, this one time, if you say, you always do this, you always say that. Well, all they have to do is find that one time that they didn't, and then you're on the defensive. It's better to just leave that word out, and we'll show you a formula of how to deal with this. Never, same thing. And then I can't, that is self-defeating. It may not be said out loud, or it may be said in your mind, but that becomes self-defeating. You actually can. And so try to pull that word out of this part of your discussion. An important thing when we're sharing our opinion is having evidence and supporting our opinions with evidence. Just like in a courtroom, you present evidence in a courtroom. Here, evidence defends your position, and we may have things like demonstrations or examples. Could be stories, facts, exhibits, some expert that we're referring to, data of some kind, a story that illustrates our point. But we have something beyond just our opinion that supports and provides evidence to defend our position. Here's the formula that we use for presenting our ideas with power, and this is where we'll kind of end up with today's message. I call this the funnel, and this is a thinking and a saying process. So the first part is thinking, and you see the dotted line is the transition between what we think and then what we say. So when we think, about a subject and then what we say about the subject. There may be a cushion in between. If we're the second one sharing, we may have a cushion in between. So we start with these 3 questions. What do I think about this particular topic? I'll give you an example in a minute. Why do I think that? And then what would an example be to illustrate that? Then when we actually speak, we flip that around and we start with our example and then what this example shows, and therefore I think. So let me show you illustrate an example with an example. A friend of mine is what I'll refer to as an anti-masker. And in the days of COVID, we are aware, I believe, that wearing a mask is beneficial and it helps to reduce the transmission of disease. And it helps protect both the wearer and those that you're in proximity of. But a friend of mine got all excited because she's an anti-masker and she was going on and on about not wearing, about this being a big conspiracy theory and people shouldn't wear masks and we shouldn't be forced to wear masks. So I thought to myself, what do I think about that? Well, this is all taking place in my mind. Well, I disagree. I think that wearing masks is good. It's not perfect, but it's good. It's helpful. It prevents disease. Why do I think that? Well, I've read a lot of articles about it. I've read a lot of the actual research about it. And at the time, I had just read an article in the New Yorker by Atul Gawande. Some of you may have read that. Atul Gawande on May 13th wrote an article in the New Yorker about ways to help reduce the spread of the coronavirus. And in that article, he talked about masking and about the use of the mask and all the research that goes into the mask. And he talked about particle distribution when you cough or sneeze and how the mask holds that in and keeps that from being distributed to those around you. So that was what I recalled in my head. So I used a cushion when I started. I said, I can understand why wearing a mask might be uncomfortable and how you might feel that way. Let me share an example with you. I just read an article by Atul Gawande, and he's a famous surgeon. He's very well known and very reliable. And he wrote in the New Yorker, and I went through the article with her, and I said, I think this example shows that there's a lot of research out there, scientific evidence that masking really helps. Therefore, I think we should be wearing masks when we're in public to reduce the spread of the coronavirus. And then I actually shared with her a handful of articles. It shut her down. She stopped. So that's how that tool works. We're going to, when we get together in class later in this week, we're going to have an opportunity to practice that, kind of talk it through. There'll be an example scenario, and it is a COVID-19 example scenario. So when you come to class, you'll pair up with somebody and you'll talk about a caseload going up in your organization. The COVID-19 caseload has resurged dramatically in your hospital organization, and senior leadership has asked you to describe the steps you will take using one of the following. And then you will choose one of these methods to address the issues in your organization. This is all made up, of course, but this is just an illustration to see how this tool works. And you can choose one of these. And then one person will take one side of the argument and the other person will take the other side. Not really an argument, but one position, and the other person will take the opposite position. So if it's a redeployment of staff to the ICU, one person would be in favor of that. That would be their recommendation. And the other person would be opposed to that. And you both would look for an example of how redeployment of staff to the ICU would either be helpful to the organization or it could be hurtful to the organization. And you look for an example to share from your own personal experience about that situation. We'll talk more about it in class. So you'll work in pairs. We'll do that for about 15 minutes and we'll walk through the process that I just walked through with you. Thinking and then saying, and we'll have a chance to get some feedback with each other. Thank you for allowing me to be part of your class. I appreciate it. Again, I'm Warren Smedley with the Kinetics Group, and I look forward to meeting you in person. Thank you. Have a good day.